Yo, what's going on, everybody? This is Nothing But Bangers, aka MBB, aka Bangers, aka I'm back with an improvement on what I think is tier list. Okay, I've been seeing a ton of tier lists all over YouTube, and honestly, I hadn't made one yet, but I figure let me give you something that I think is a little bit more applicable, not a word, right, to what it means to successfully and accurately rate some of these decks that we see in Pokemon Pocket. So let's just get straight to it. So the first deck that I'm going to show you, and what I'm going to call this, is MBB Power Rankings Week 1. So I've got the date, so we'll be able to kind of check back in if there's any big changes, maybe new cards get released. And I don't have every deck in the meta on this video, but I've got a few decks. And in the comments, let me know what deck you want me to add to the power rankings in this format. So let's go over the criteria that I'm using right here. So I'm using early game as one criteria, mid to late game as another criteria, overall power in terms of like damage, right, as another criteria, health in terms of like HP in the deck, you know, what's the HP look like in this deck, and then overall just consistency, like how often are the games, you know, looking very similar, you know, how consistent is the deck, is it playing, you know, a lot of evolutions, is it playing a lot of basics, is it playing only basics, like what's going on there with the consistency, and then again, how consistent do the games look pretty much every game, right? So let's just kind of dive into the details. So to start off with Pikachu EX, obviously early game, it's a 5 out of 5. It's the best early game in the entire Pokemon Pocket game right now. What do I mean by that? Well, it's got the best early game setup in terms of it's either dealing 20 or it's dealing, you know, as much as 90 or sometimes dealing 60 in the first couple of turns of the game. Like that is pretty much unmatched by most decks. So that's why I'm going to give it a 5 out of 5 for early game. Also, in some versions, you know, you don't even need to evolve to do this, right? In terms of the mid game to late game, this is where Pikachu can kind of fall off, right? Because it does have like a decent mid game where it's dealing that 90 every turn potentially, or maybe it's 70 with, you know, Electrode, or maybe, you know, in the late game it's finishing something off with Raichu for 140. But really, when you look at this, I think that the mid to late game is probably where this deck struggles the most, right? Like if you get Pikachu to late game where it's got a bunch of damage spread out, you know, and it's only able to hit for 90 unless you're getting really lucky with coin flips with Zapdos, right? Flipping, even 50% flipping heads is 100 damage for Zapdos, which kind of leads into, you know, the overall power rating that I gave this, which is a 3.5 out of 5. So everything's out of 5 for the ratings. And when I take a look at this deck, I'm saying, man, you know, the late game, it's kind of lacking, so I'll give it a 3.5 out of 5. For the power, I'm going to give it 3.5 out of 5 as well, because it's just really hard for this deck to swing for more than 100, right? And then when you start seeing Pokemon that are 150 HP and then they're healing with Potion or Erica, this deck can really struggle to take care of that unless it's playing, you know, that Raichu version, or unless you're just getting lucky flipping heads. And it's something that you're going to hear me say all the time. If you're flipping heads, you're probably winning anyways, right? If your opponent's flipping heads, they're probably winning anyways, like most of the time, right? When it comes to health, I think this is another area of weakness of Pikachu, where it's pretty squishy compared to some other EX Pokemon. And then Zapdos is a little bit thicker than Pikachu, right? It's got that, I think it's 140 HP. It might be 120, 130. You can zoom in on the picture, but just to kind of give it reference, you know, it's just a little bit weaker in terms of hit points. When you talk about comparing it to Mewtwo, you compare it to some of the bigger stage 2 EXs. And granted, it is a basic, right? These are basics. When you talk about consistency, I mean, this game is just going to be very consistent, right? This deck is going to be very consistent. It's going to pretty much do the same thing almost every game. It's going to find a way to get to Pikachu EX if it doesn't open it, or it's going to have other basics or stage 1s, if it plays the stage 1s, that are going to start dealing damage pretty quickly, right? And so overall, I think that's one of the best things about this deck is the amount of bricks that Pikachu EX has is a lot less than most other decks usually. Like the bricks that Pikachu EX has is usually better than the bricks that other decks have. That also kind of factored into the consistency. So overall, I gave this, you know, a 4 out of 5 basically when I added everything up. And I think that, yeah, I mean, there's clear weaknesses with this deck that kind of knock it down from that perfect 5 out of 5. I don't think we have a perfect deck in Pokemon Pocket, but I do think that this deck is probably the best when you take a look at all these metrics. So let's get to another deck really quickly. All right, so here is another deck, Mewtwo EX. So let's talk about this as well. So early game, again, you do want to open Mewtwo. Opening Ralts can be a little bit rough, and that's why I gave this a 3.5 or a 3 out of 5. And again, like, you know, you do want to make sure that you're getting to that Ralts ASAP, and when you open it and only Ralts, that can put you in a little bit of a bind. The mid to late game is pretty strong, in my opinion. It's probably stronger, slightly stronger than the Raichu, because Raichu is only going to be like a one-time thing. And then when you talk about Pikachu, again, I gave Pikachu about the same grade, but just this 150 a turn is going to be devastating if they're able to go ahead and get that Gardevoir online. So I mean, it is a little bit of give and take, but I think roughly, you know, it's probably about the same as Pikachu EX once it gets going, except, you know, it is going to be dealing more damage consistently, but it takes more to get set up, right? It takes a little bit more. So I called that just about even when you compare this with Pikachu. In terms of power, I gave this a 4.5 out of 5 compared to Pikachu, which had 3.5 out of 5. And one of the reasons why I didn't give it a perfect score is it's not the most powerful in terms of power in the game, but 150, it literally holds a lot of decks out of contention, right? You start looking at the Nidoking, Nidoqueen family, you start looking at Alakazam, even though Alakazam can one-shot Mewtwo in perfect scenarios and whatnot. But again, when you start looking at that 150, I mean, 150 is pretty rough for a lot of Pokemon to survive, and that's why I would say that, you know, this power is going to be a 4.5 out of 5, because once this deck gets going, the game tends to end very quickly after it, right? Once Gardevoir hits the field, and once Mewtwo has that fourth energy for the first time, like, the game usually wraps up pretty quickly. So it's a very powerful deck. In terms of health, I did give the health a 3.5 out of 5, which again is slightly better than Pikachu EX, just because, you know, when you take a look at Mewtwo's bulk, 150 HP, bigger than Starmie, bigger than Articuno, bigger than Pikachu EX. It's on the big side for the basics, right? However, again, when you compare it to those Stage 2 EXs, it is slightly smaller, so I didn't want to give it, yeah, too much of a high rating. And plus, Gardevoir is only 110 HP, and even though that doesn't get one-shot a lot, it's one of those things where, hey, you know, it's not necessarily the bulkiest Stage 2 in the game. But again, 110, it does kind of save it from being one-shot a lot of times. In terms of consistency, I gave this a 3.5 out of 5. And one of the reasons why I gave the consistency a little bit of a lower rating is you do need to find evolutions, and evolutions are not something that you can tutor. But again, the games are not going to vary. They're not going to be very different, right? They're going to be pretty much the same games almost every game. Like, almost every game is going to look identical because the deck is so linear. Like, it's built to do one thing pretty much. Build Mewtwo and then power up or build Gardevoir and then power up Mewtwo, right? I guess that's kind of two things, but that's the single strategy, right? So again, overall, I gave this a 3.6 out of 5 when I added up all the numbers. And again, it's got power, it's linear, and it's consistent, you know, and that linear can be a double-edged sword, right? Like, there's not really a lot of room to tech against that Charizard matchup, right? Speaking of Charizard, let's talk about Charizard EX. So early game, this is the lowest rating that I've given. Actually, I guess it's up there with Mewtwo. But again, I kind of, you know, rated this about the same in terms of early game as Mewtwo. And like, here's the give and take with that, okay? You may be thinking, well, MBB, you know, Mewtwo deals 50 in the early game. You know, Moltres is just flipping coins, and you're exactly right. But the reason why I gave it the same rating is those coin flips can be just devastating, you know, to building up on the bench, right? When you see your opponent flip 2 heads or 3 heads, you know, you're just looking at that energy ramp and you're like, oh, wow, now I just have to hope that they brick on Charmander, right? Hopefully they just only have Charmander or they only have Charmeleon. So it is very reliant on Moltres to start, but again, I do think that this is roughly, you know, the same early game as in terms of, you know, 3 out of 5 as, you know, a deck like a Mewtwo EX. Again, obviously not as strong as Pikachu EX. The Pikachu EX just hits you right away. When you talk about mid to late game, if the evolutions show up, I mean, it's easily just very powerful, right? Obviously, you have to flip some heads with Moltres, but again, if the evolutions show up, it can just be very devastating. But again, it is damage capped at 70. If you are not able to hit those, hit those evolutions and you're stuck attaching to Moltres, which Moltres, it can put in work for 70 damage, but that's just on the lower end of what a lot of these decks do once they get going. In terms of power, I give it perfect rating, 5 out of 5, because again, it's the highest damage output in the game, right? And once Charizard gets going, that 200 is going to deal with literally everything in the game. Now, you may only get one time to do that 200, but again, it should be enough to swing the game in your favor, especially with Charizard's bulk. When you talk about health, Moltres and Charizard have great bulk, right? When you talk about their bulk, you're looking at, I think, let's see, Zapdos has 130, Moltres has 140, and Articuno has 140. So, you're looking at, very bulky legendary bird plus very bulky stage 2 if they're able to hit the board. And in comparison to other decks, that's generally some of the best bulk that you're going to see, right? Then when you talk about consistency, I gave it a 3 out of 5 because, again, it's a stage 2 deck and it's gonna revolve a little bit around coin flips. So I didn't want to give it as high of a consistency rating as a Pikachu, obviously, because Pikachu just kind of is very... It's pretty dang consistent and has very few bricks, and even the bricks of Pikachu, like I mentioned earlier, are usually better than the other bricks. And then in terms of comparing it to Mewtwo, I gave Mewtwo a slightly higher rating in consistency because, again, Mewtwo can actually win you the game by itself. Moltres is probably not going to win you a game by itself, right? And so if you get cut off from your Charizard, compared to if you're playing, Mewtwo and you get cut off from Gardevoir, the chances are you can actually still win with Mewtwo, but winning with with just Moltres, it's probably going to be very tough. Okay, so overall, I gave this actually a higher score than the Mewtwo deck, 3.7 out of 5. When I added up all the numbers, and like when you think about it, that rock paper scissors diagram, right? Pikachu can beat both of these decks, Mewtwo and Charizard. It can beat them, right? Against Mewtwo, it's maybe a little bit of a coin flip sometimes, but against Charizard, Pikachu should win more times than not. However, when Charizard goes up against Mewtwo, Charizard has that bulk, and once the train gets going, it's very hard to stop because Mewtwo just gets knocked out and they have to have another Mewtwo powered up. So typically, Charizard will be at a slight advantage going up against Mewtwo. But again, so you can kind of see that these ratings do kind of match up with kind of how some people see the big three. Let's get into some other decks. So this is another deck that you see a little bit of on the ladder, and then again, you'll see it pop up in tournaments. And again, I'm not attaching deck lists, I'm just talking about the core cards, because again, I think that the core cards kind of give you more of an idea of what these decks tend to do. So Articuno and Starmie, both EXs. In terms of early game, I gave it an above average early game rating because Misty is there and Misty can just high roll you, and Starmie EX is just pound for pound one of the best cards in the game, right? If you drop a Starmie EX on curve and you start swinging for 90, and then you can retreat for free, and as soon as you retreat, now it makes, hey, now I can just switch into a free retreater, if something gets knocked out, which is huge. So I'm saving energy there too. It's just pound for pound a really good card. And so I gave this a better early game than Mewtwo and Charizard, just because of that potential of both Starmie EX or Misty, right? In terms of the mid to late game, I gave it a 3. And this is actually lower than Mewtwo and Charizard, and it's actually lower than Pikachu as well. And one of the reasons why I gave it a lower mid to late game is, even though the attacks, can be done at a very early part of the game, they're kind of capped, right? You start seeing these attacks being capped at 80 to 90 damage, and when you compare them to Pikachu EX, which is dealing 90, fairly about as consistent as these water decks will do, 80 and 90, and obviously those damage spikes like a 140 from a Raichu. And then when you take a look at Mewtwo, Mewtwo's dealing 150, right? Once it gets going. Charizard dealing 200. So in my opinion, I just kind of thought that the mid to late game for Starmie EX and Articuno EX can kind of fall off a little bit more compared to Charizard and a Mewtwo and a Pikachu in that, if we're comparing them. In terms of power, again, I did kind of rate it about the same as a Pikachu, but lower than a Mewtwo and lower than a Charizard at that 3.5. Again, 80 to 90 damage is your cap, unless you're using damage modifiers and or weaknesses. When you take a look about talk about health, I do think that 130 and 140 is pretty reasonable, because a lot of things are not one-shotting it. Like even Pikachu EX is not one-shotting these Pokemon unless there's damage already on it. So that's a huge bonus. However, you know, Mewtwo is going to eat all of these alive, right? It's going to eat these alive, and you know, it's going to survive one shot. And if Mewtwo gets to attack first and get a knockout, you know, there's pretty much no chance that you're going to overcome that Mewtwo unless it already had damage. So again, in terms of health, I rated this lower than Charizard and about the same as Mewtwo, and then again slightly higher than Pikachu EX. So hopefully that sounds reasonable. Again, I want to know your thoughts, because this is kind of a new way of just kind of measuring decks and kind of giving a little bit more than just your normal, oh, this deck is tier 1, this deck is tier 2, like just trying to give you a little bit more nuance. In terms of consistency, I gave it a 3.5 out of 5 because again, it does rely sometimes on our early Misty or a Starmie EX, which, you know, again, they can be questionable because you're not always going to hit Starmie EX on curve, and you're not always going to flip heads, you know. So that's kind of one of those things that I rated it a 3.5 at. And again, it's about on par with Mewtwo EX and Gardevoir in terms of consistency, because you are playing usually such a low number of basics that you are gonna see similar cards every game. But it's just the coin flipping aspect that kind of made me, you know, lower this a little bit. But again, not as consistent as Pikachu EX, about the same consistency in my mind as like a Mewtwo Gardevoir. In terms of overall, it's going to be a 3.4 out of 5. It's a very good deck, but with Pikachu existing, it's just tough to get, you know, these threats going without, you know, getting knocked out in the process, right? Your Staryu getting knocked out early, or your Articuno getting chipped early, and now it's just kind of waiting to be knocked out, right? So again, still think it's a strong deck, but let's go on to another version of a water deck, which is going to be Greninja and Starmie EX. Now, I did try to have a little bit of nuance here, right? So again, Starmie EX is going to carry the game early if you open it. If you got the Frog Boys, you know, that's going to be a little bit more tough, right? And in the mid game, again, it's going to be dependent on evolving before getting knocked out. So again, I had to lower that to, you know, compared to some other decks, to a 3 out of 5. When you talk about raw power, it's going to be capped at about 90 to 110 damage usually, right? 110 is basically saying you have Starmie EX and Greninja on your bench, right? Maybe you have 2 Greninjas, maybe the damage is capped at 130 if you're really lucky, right? But I just typically don't see that happen in a lot of the times, you know, in games that I've seen with these decks, right? So it's not bad power, but again, you know, it's about the same as the other water deck. It's definitely, you know, about the same as Pikachu EX, but definitely weaker than a Mewtwo and a Charizard. In terms of health, again, Greninja is just slightly less bulkier than, you know, the Articuno and Starmie deck, if you're not including Articuno in this deck, because again, there's a little bit of a space issue. You may not be able to fit Articuno EX in this deck, so that's kind of why I'm kind of not factoring it. You could easily bump it up to a 3.5 if you do find a way to have space for everything, but I don't know how you would do that, honestly. You might be cutting Misty at that case, in that case, right? Which maybe that's acceptable for some people. I don't know. In terms of consistency, again, I'm gonna compare this to the other water deck that I just mentioned. For Articuno and Starmie EX, I gave it a 3.5. For this, I gave it 3 out of 5. And it's only because it's a stage 2. That's the only reason, right? Like with the Articuno and Starmie deck, you're basically saying, hey, I'm only evolving one Pokemon, which is Starmie EX. With this deck, you're evolving Starmie EX and Greninja. So you do need to get a little bit, you do need to be evolving and kind of leaning into that. And with no way to search for evolutions, you know, you are kind of at risk at just not seeing the evolutions that you need at the right time. And so that's why I gave this a slightly lower rating in terms of consistency. Overall, 3.2 out of 5, which is slightly lower than Articuno EX and Starmie EX. All right, now this was a deck that was actually very tough for me to try and rate. This is Venusaur and Exeggutor, also known as Venu Egg. Obviously, this deck, yeah, I'm probably biased, even though I tried to go back and lower the ratings on this. And again, like, let's just kind of look at these one by one. So in terms of the early game, I gave the early game the same rating as the water decks, right? Because it's a stage 1 that can put pressure on almost every deck. And unlike Starmie, it only needs 1 energy. The reason why I gave it a 3.5, as opposed to, the Charizard and the Mewtwo, which had 3s, is because in the deck list that I'm probably like leaning more towards in Venusaur EX and Exeggutor, you're playing 3 Exeggutors. So if you have Pokeball, and you have any of the Exeggutors, you're going to be able to start putting pressure, pretty early if you can find an egg and evolve it, right? On top of that, let's just not skirt around the fact you must evolve egg. That's the honest truth. If you don't evolve your Exeggutor, it's just going to be knocked out very quickly. In some games, it's just going to get donked, right? So like you can't give it really a 4 or a 5, or a 4.5, just because like you're relying on evolving literally like your turn 2, right? So you got to kind of take that into account. Even though you are playing, 3 evolutions, 3 stage 1s, yeah, there's still a statistical chance that you don't see it by that turn. And then obviously opening Bulbasaur is like, rest in peace, right? In terms of the mid to late game, I thought that this is one of the stronger decks in terms of the mid game to late game. Because if you can evolve to that Venusaur, or you can keep the game going longer, extend the life of your Pokemon with things like Erica, you're literally changing your opponent's math and you're surviving longer, and you're potentially getting to a point where they just can't knock out your Pokemon. And so in terms of the mid to late game, I believe that this is the highest rating so far out of any deck that I've gone over in terms of the mid to late game. And I think that that's the advantage of Venusaur and Exeggutor, right? It's the fact that it can put pressure early game, but if it gets to that late game, if it gets to that mid game and it's evolving Venusaur and it's building it up, it's going to be very tough to overcome, because there's only really one Pokemon that deals with Venusaur EX, pretty much right away, and that's Charizard. In terms of power, that 30 damage, as low as 30 damage, as high as 100 damage. So I didn't want to give it a higher power rating than something like a Mewtwo, obviously. And, again, even 3.5 may be a little bit high. But again, the reason why I gave it 3.5 is instead of 3, for example, is because that Venusaur attack, it can just straight up wall people off. Even though it's 100, if you factor in the healing that it does, I mean, really, if you factor in the healing, that's 130 damage of 130 HP swing, right? Because you're healing 30 but dealing 100. So that's 130 damage swing, right? Which is on par with a Mewtwo, basically. I mean, it's 20 less than a Mewtwo. So again, it can just become a game where your opponent just is going up against the wall and they end up conceding because they can't get past the Venusaur. In terms of health, this is easily the most bulky deck that we have in the game on this list so far. Because again, not only do you have big bulk with 130 HP, 160 HP, 190 HP, you have Erica. All right, and Erica just extends the life of those Pokemon, and then again, Venusaur is healing itself. So the deck just it's very bulky, and it has a healing factor, which can make it able to claw back from games where maybe you do suffer an early knockout from a Pikachu EX that has the best early game in the game, or early game, in the entire game, right? So again, I was trying not to be biased, but again, when I just look at the facts, the fact is that power, it's not great, but when it gets going, it's pretty dang good. The fact is that late game, it's very good. It's one of the best in the game. And the fact is, health is one of the strong points of this entire deck, right? It's the fact that it can evolve, and all of a sudden, when it's evolved, it's very bulky, okay? So again, that's just my thoughts. Again, maybe I'm biased. Maybe it should be a 4 out of 5 instead of a 4.5. But again, the bulk and the healing factor just made me give it that 4.5, okay? And in comparison, again, the other highest score was, Charizard having 4 out of 5. So I basically am saying that Venusaur and Exeggutor are bulkier than Charizard and Moltres, which 190 versus 180, and then 160 versus 140, and then 2 130s versus 140. So, plus the healing. So to me, it makes sense. In terms of consistency, I gave it a 3 out of 5. And the reason for that is it's reliant on multiple evolutions. And even though, your deck is mainly built to be just for your strategy, there's not disruption, right? You're not playing extra red cards. You're not playing extra potions. You're not playing but one Sabrina. Your deck is focused on thinning and hopefully evolving on curve and having options to evolve. But again, you're relying on evolutions. And so I can't give it a 4 out of 5. I can't give it a 5 out of 5, obviously. So I gave this a 3 out of 5. So overall, I gave this deck a 3.7 out of 5 when I did all the math. Again, it's powerful when evolving on curve, and it can just dominate the mid to late game. All right, let's get into a couple of the other decks that maybe scored a little bit lower on this end, but I want to add an asterisk. These are one prize decks that I'm about to talk about. So even though the overall rating may be low, I think it's important to notice that some of these decks are going to match up very well with other decks that have higher scores just because they are one prize decks. So in terms of the early game for Blaine's Ninetails, it's going to be reliant on specific stage ones, right? You're going to need that Rapidash, or you're going to need that Ninetails, and you better have the basic that goes with them. And ideally, if you're going first, you want Ponyta. If you're going second, you want Vulpix. So the early game, it does have its benefits, but it is also kind of reliant on, like, hope you got the right basic, hope you win on the right turn. For the mid to late game, it's got a decent mid game and late game, kind of, right? Because it's got that ability to just suddenly do 120, and it can do 120 very quickly, right? As you'll see in the next part when I talk about power. But the problem is the bulk, right? It's not a very bulky deck, right? Rapidash and Ninetales are pretty glassy. They're even glassier than Pikachu EX, right? But again, the trade-off is they're one prize Pokemon, right? So when you talk about power, 90 to 120 damage, very solid. Again, when you talk about Rapidash dealing potentially 70, that's pretty solid, right? Magmar, if you decide to play Magmar, again, that's what, 80 damage with Blaine. So again, that's not bad. It's just, again, when you talk about the best attacks in terms of like the ratings that I've been giving, Mewtwo 4.5, that's dealing 150, and then Charizard, obviously 5 out of 5 is dealing, 200. If you compare this, it's about the same level as the Starmie decks and the Greninja decks, where it's dealing around that 80 to 110, that 90 to 120 range, right? So just to kind of give you some comparisons there. In terms of health, again, 2.5 out of 5. This is the worst bulk out of all the decks. But again, the trade-off is they're one prizers. In terms of consistency, I gave this a 3 out of 5. Very similar to how I rated Venusaur. You could argue that it's even it's maybe a little bit more consistent than Venusaur, because it's reliant on stage 1s and then a trainer card, which is kind of a pseudo stage 2, right? But the thing is, with Blaine, you can play it the same turn you evolve, into a Ninetales or a Rapidash. So, hey, you can make the argument consistency, it could be a little bit higher. It could be a 3.5 out of 5. I don't know. What do you think? But again, overall, I gave this deck roughly a 3 out of 5, right? It's powerful when it's drawing in good sequence, and it has the ability to compete with top EX decks, and it just dominated another non-EX tournament. Just dominated. So, yeah, that's definitely a thing. Right, the last deck that I will talk about, and again, thank you for taking time out of your day to watch this. I hope that you walk away from this video thinking, this is a pretty interesting way to evaluate decks. What other decks, might you want to see me evaluate? And again, I'll try to do this every week and add in new decks. So definitely drop a deck in the comments that maybe I didn't rate that I need to rate. Like, I can think of Alakazam decks for sure. I can think of other Greninja decks for sure, Weezing decks. So let me know in the comments. I'm curious on your thoughts. And then, maybe you think I'm wrong on some of these. Let me know. But let's talk about Primeape and Sandslash, the new juice that just got released in a recent event with Lapras. But early game, I wanted to give this a 3.5 out of 5 because it can pressure very early for as much as 70 to 100. And again, the only thing that's a little bit tough is it's definitely reliant on surviving and evolving. So you might be wondering, like, hey, you gave Blaine's Ninetales a 3. You're giving this a 3.5. I do think that, hey, maybe it could be adjusted there. Maybe there's room. But I did think that, when you talk about Sandslash, it's slightly more consistent when you compare it to Rapidash. So I would give the edge to Sandslash there over Rapidash. But when you talk about Primeape versus Ninetales, it's very clear that, hey, Ninetales is probably a little bit more consistent than Primeape, because Primeape has, they're both about the same bulk, right? But the issue is you do need to have that damage put onto Primeape. And maybe you're going to be in situations where, hey, you're not able to put that damage on it without it getting knocked out, so you just can't. So you can, I could definitely see, swapping that early game around. I don't know, but again, this is not super reliant on did you draw Sandshrew first and Mankey first versus Blaine's Ninetales, where, hey, you better draw this first, you better draw Ponyta going first, and you better draw Vulpix going second. If not, it's gonna be weird. With this, you could open Sandshrew or Mankey and still feel solid about it, but when you talk about mid to late game, Primeape can definitely be dead, which is a reason why I gave this a lower rating than Blaine's Ninetails, because I said, hey, I've played this deck, and Primeape against some matchups, it's just going to get one shot. Like, you're going to put it in and it's just going to get one shot before you can even attack with it sometimes, right? Because you're maybe dealing 40 damage with it, right? Because as soon as they attack, they're just knocking it out. So again, Primeape can be kind of dead, in mid to late game, depending on the matchup. And then obviously Sandslash is damage capped at 70, so you might be in a situation where the most you can do is like 70 damage when you get to mid to late game, and that's a problem. Okay, even if you are a one price deck, that's a problem. So I gave this a lower rating than Blaine's Ninetails. And again, when you talk about power, 70 to 100 damage cap. So I gave it a lower power rating than all the water decks, than pretty much it's the lowest rating so far that we've talked about, just because, again, that 100 is conditional, and then that 70 just is not going to do it in every matchup, right? In terms of health, it does share the bulk problem, similar to Blaine's Ninetails decks. So I gave it the same rating, right? And again, I forgot to edit the bulky and healing factors. I'm just now seeing that. I thought I edited it. But again, when you take a look at this, ignore that part. It's just not as bulky. It's got the same issues in terms of Blaine's Ninetails decks. And then again, it's got the same consistency issues. So you can see some similarities between Blaine's Ninetails in this deck, but it's going to be very reliant on multiple evolutions. So, keep that in mind. So overall, I gave it a 2.8 out of 5, so slightly less powerful than Blaine's Ninetails. I think most people would agree with that. People want it to be better. Maybe the Marowak version is better. Maybe that's what I should be evaluating. Maybe I'll evaluate that in my next video or power rankings. But yeah, let me know what you think, and let's take a look at the total of all these power rankings. So in conclusion, these are the decks that I went over, and you can kind of see at the top, I tried to kind of color coordinate it. And I want to point out one thing that a lot of people are going to notice right away is the fact that Venusaur does have a higher rating than Mewtwo EX, yet it's ranked below Mewtwo EX. And, just to justify that a little bit, I think that even though a deck may have a specific score, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's better or worse than the decks that are above it. It just means that in my evaluation, that's the score that I gave it. You're going to see decks that score lower, but are still able to beat some of the matchups that are higher scores, right? Like, for example, Blaine's Ninetails can beat Pikachu. Blaine's Ninetails can beat Exeggutor EX and Venusaur EX, right? But, also looking at other decks, Primeape and Sandslash, it can beat Pikachu EX, right? In an ideal situation or in some situations. So just because a deck has a specific rating doesn't necessarily mean that, it's worse than the decks that are above it. It just means that by the metrics that I'm looking at, that's just kind of where they score. But in terms of my actual rankings, I think Pikachu's the top dog. I think Charizard, just because it beats Mewtwo, it beats Venusaur, it probably loses to the water decks, but the water decks don't take up that big of a part of the meta. I think that would probably be my number 2 deck. But again, when you take a look at 2 and 3, I mean, they're all kind of neck and neck. Even 4, with Venusaur can beat Pikachu if it gets to that mid to late game, right? If it draws Exeggutor, it can be a really big issue for Pikachu decks. On the flip side, against Charizard, it's very tough to beat Charizard. And against Mewtwo, it's kind of a 50-50, right? If you get that early Exeggutor and you're able to start chipping away at that Mewtwo, and then all of a sudden Venusaur comes out, like, Mewtwo has a problem dealing with that, right? So there is that. And then Mewtwo EX, even though it's number 3, like, Mewtwo EX can straight up just beat Pikachu sometimes. Sure, it's a little bit 50-50, but it can definitely take care of Pikachu. However, head-to-head against Charizard, probably going to be tough to win sometimes, especially if the Charizard deck gets going. Because that bulk that Charizard has is just very tough for Mewtwo and Gardevoir to overcome. When you take a look at the water decks, again, the water decks, hey, maybe you can make the argument that the water decks are higher than Venusaur. I don't know. I mean, that's completely up to you. But for my first initial power rankings, these are my top 8 decks. And again, if I evaluate more decks, you're going to expect to see these decks be rearranged. So let me know what decks you want me to add to this, and let's keep this going. I want to do more power rankings and get away from tier lists, because I think this just has more nuance. Let me know what you think in the comments, and stay tuned to the end because there's going to be some videos popping up that I would really appreciate you checking out. Peace.